Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is one of history's most notorious criminals, known for his brutal killings in London's Whitechapel district in 1888. His true identity remains a mystery, and his name has become synonymous with terror. Little is known about the killer's background. Born in the shadows of Victorian London, where poverty and crime ran rampant, Jack the Ripper's early life is a mystery. Some believe he had medical knowledge, as the precision of his crimes suggested expertise in anatomy. His victims, all women, were vulnerable and lived in the squalid streets of Whitechapel, often turning to prostitution to survive. The first known victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was found on August 31, 1888. Her throat was slashed, and her body was mutilated. Just days later, Annie Chapman was discovered with similar wounds and a grotesque level of mutilation. But it was on the night of September 30, 1888, that the Ripper struck twice. Elizabeth Stride was found with her throat cut but no other mutilation, leading some to believe the killer was interrupted. Minutes later, Catherine Eddowes was found in another part of Whitechapel. Her body was disemboweled, showing the killer's brutal signature. The killings were swift, silent, and calculated. Despite a massive police investigation, the Ripper was never caught. The lack of solid evidence and no witnesses left the case unsolved. As the murders ceased, so did the hunt, but the fear remained. Letters supposedly from the Ripper, some taunting police, only added to the mystery. Over the years, Jack the Ripper has become a figure of legend. His identity has been the subject of endless speculation, with theories ranging from a doctor to a member of the royal family. His crimes and the unanswered questions surrounding them have kept the world captivated for over a century. Jack the Ripper's legacy endures in books, films, and documentaries, cementing his place as one of the most chilling and enigmatic figures in history. Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, born on August 7, 1560, in the Kingdom of Hungary, is one of history's most notorious figures, often associated with cruelty, violence, and the dark rumors surrounding her life. Born into an aristocratic family, Bathory's early life seemed privileged. She was well educated and married at the age of 15 to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier who spent much of his time away from home. During his absence, Bathory's life took a dark turn. The rumors began to circulate around 1602, when local villagers accused Bathory of torturing and killing young servant girls. These claims were dismissed by many as exaggerated or politically motivated. However, as time went on, reports of her violent acts grew. It was said that Bathory believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would preserve her youth and beauty. Whether or not she truly believed this is still a topic of debate, but the terrifying reports about her cruelty became impossible to ignore. Bathory was known for luring young girls from poor families to her castle, promising them work or education. Once there, they would reportedly be subjected to unspeakable tortures, beatings, mutilations, and ultimately, death. Her servants and accomplices were said to have assisted in these acts, with some even claiming that they were ordered to collect the blood of the girls for Bathory's supposed bath rituals. In 1610, the authorities took action. King Matthias II ordered an investigation into Bathory's activities after a local pastor reported the killings. When soldiers arrived at her castle, they found evidence of the horrific crimes, including the bodies of young women. Bathory was arrested, but her high social status allowed her to avoid a public trial. Instead, she was placed under house arrest in her castle, where she would remain until her death in 1614. Despite her death, Elizabeth Bathory's legend lived on. She became the subject of numerous myths and legends, often portrayed as a bloodthirsty, immortal figure. Her legacy has been immortalized in books, films, and popular culture, though much of the truth about her crimes remains shrouded in mystery. Was she truly guilty of the horrors she was accused of, or was she the victim of political intrigue? Regardless, her story remains one of the most chilling in criminal history. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos, born on February 29, 1956, in Troy, Michigan, had a troubled and tragic start to life. Her father, a convicted child molester, was absent during her early years, and her mother, who abandoned Aileen when she was just 4 years old, left her to be raised by her grandparents. Eileen's childhood was marked by abuse and neglect, experiences that would haunt her throughout her life. By her late teens, Aileen had turned to prostitution to survive, often in dangerous situations. She moved to Florida, where her killing spree began. Wuornos murdered 7 men between 1989 and 1990, claiming that she killed them in self-defense during attempted sexual assaults. She was often picked up by these men while working as a prostitute, and each killing followed a similar pattern. Aileen would shoot the men in their vehicles before stealing their possessions and fleeing the scene. Her murders were initially difficult to link, but in 1990, after a series of confessions and a widespread investigation, Wuornos was arrested. Her capture came after she and her lover, Tyria Moore, were implicated in the crimes. Wuornos was eventually convicted of 6 of the murders and sentenced to death. During her trial, Wuornos claimed she was a victim of sexual violence and argued that she killed in self-defense. Despite her defense, she was convicted, and her death sentence was upheld. Aileen Wuornos spent over a decade on death row before she was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Wuornos' story has become one of the most famous in true crime history, partly because of the controversial nature of her case. Was she a victim driven to kill in self-defense, or a cold-blooded murderer? Her life and crimes were later portrayed in the 2003 film Monster, where actress Charlize Theron famously portrayed Wuornos and won an Academy Award for her performance. Aileen Wuornos' legacy continues to be debated, as her case raised questions about the justice system, mental health, and the experiences of women in the criminal world. Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais, born in 1405 in France, was once a respected military captain and companion to Joan of Arc. He was a man of noble birth, wealth, and influence, rising to prominence in the early 15th century as a knight and war hero. He played a crucial role in the 100 Years' War, serving as a trusted leader in the army of King Charles VII of France. His bravery in battle earned him admiration and fame, and he was granted vast estates. However, Gilles de Rais' reputation would take a dark turn after the death of Joan of Arc in 1431. As his wealth grew, so did his appetite for darker, more depraved activities. His life began to spiral into madness, and he became notorious for the horrific crimes he would later commit. Between 1432 and 1440, de Rais was accused of abducting, torturing, and murdering over 140 children, mostly young boys, though some sources suggest the actual number may have been even higher. The murders took place at his estates, and his victims were often lured with promises of work or gifts. Once in his clutches, they would be subjected to unimaginable torture, including mutilation and sexual abuse, before being killed. Some accounts claim that de Rais believed the blood of the children would grant him supernatural powers or ensure his immortality. His crimes went unnoticed for years, but in 1440, his violent actions finally caught the attention of the church and local authorities. After a series of investigations, de Rais was arrested, and the details of his horrific acts were revealed. At trial, many witnesses came forward, and de Rais confessed to the murders, though some historians believe his confession was coerced under torture. Gilles de Rais was convicted of heresy, witchcraft, and the murder of numerous children. He was sentenced to death and, on October 26, 1440, was hanged and then burned at the stake. His execution marked the end of one of the most gruesome chapters in French history. Despite his brutal crimes, de Rais' legacy has been shrouded in mystery. His noble background and heroic role in the military led some to question the true extent of his guilt, with some theorists suggesting that he may have been the victim of political intrigue or a smear campaign. However, the horror of his actions and the shocking nature of his crimes have earned him a place among history's most notorious criminals. The story of Gilles de Rais has been retold in books, films, and documentaries, contributing to his dark and enduring legacy as one of the first recorded serial killers in history. Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton, born in 1832 in County Durham, England, is believed to be one of the UK's first female serial killers. She came from a poor background, and after her mother's death, Mary Ann's life was marked by tragedy. She had a series of marriages, but each one ended in death, with her husbands and children dying under suspicious circumstances. In her early adult years, Mary Ann worked as a nurse, which gave her access to drugs like arsenic. Her first husband, George Ward, died in 1865, and shortly after, Mary Ann married his cousin, James Cotton. James also fell ill and died under strange circumstances. Over the following years, Mary Ann would marry again, and each time, her spouse would mysteriously die, along with several of her children. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. The method of death was always similar. She would use arsenic to poison her victims, a practice that was not immediately detectable at the time. She would then collect the life insurance money and move on to the next victim, often within the same community. Her pattern of poisoning became so widespread that the local population began to notice, but it wasn't until the suspicious death of her stepson that the authorities began to investigate. In 1873, after the death of her stepson, the police began looking into Mary Ann's past, discovering a series of similar deaths. A post-mortem revealed traces of arsenic in her stepson's body. She was arrested and charged with murder. At her trial, evidence emerged showing that Mary Ann had poisoned numerous people, including her own children. She was convicted of the murder of her stepson and sentenced to death. On March 24, 1873, Mary Ann Cotton was hanged at Durham Jail, becoming one of the most infamous female serial killers in history. Mary Ann Cotton's legacy has been the subject of much speculation. Some consider her a cold-blooded killer driven by greed, while others believe her to be a victim of circumstance, with her actions fueled by poverty and desperation. Her story has been told in books, films, and even folk songs, cementing her place in criminal history. Dick Turpin. Dick Turpin, born in 1705 in England, became one of the most infamous highwaymen in British history. Originally a butcher's son, Turpin initially worked in his family's business but turned to a life of crime in his early 20s. He joined a gang of criminals, initially committing petty thefts before escalating to more serious crimes. Turpin's life took a darker turn as he became known for his daring highway robberies. During the 1730s and 1740s, Turpin earned a reputation for his boldness, robbing coaches traveling through the English countryside. He would often disguise himself, sometimes wearing a mask and using a horse to quickly escape after holding up his victims. His method was simple yet effective. Turpin would hold up the coach, demand money or valuables, and then flee before anyone could react. However, Turpin's notoriety grew after he was involved in a series of violent crimes, including a robbery in which he killed a man. His reckless behavior eventually led to his capture. After being betrayed by a fellow gang member, Turpin was arrested and tried for the murder of a man during a robbery. Despite his attempt to flee the country, he was caught and sentenced to death. Dick Turpin was hanged on April 7, 1739, in York, England. Though he was a notorious criminal, his legacy is somewhat romanticized in popular culture. Over time, he became the subject of folk tales and ballads, often portrayed as a charming and daring rogue. His real-life crimes, however, were far from glamorous, and his brutal acts were a far cry from the heroic highwayman image often depicted in literature. Despite his short life of crime, Dick Turpin's legacy has endured in British folklore, where he remains one of the most famous criminals of the 18th century. Peter Stumpp, the Werewolf of Bedburg. Peter Stumpp, born in 1535 in the small town of Bedburg, Germany, became infamous for his chilling confessions of being a werewolf, along with a series of gruesome murders. Stumpp's life before his crimes is largely unknown, but he was a farmer by trade and lived in a rural community that had its share of superstitions and fear of witches and monsters. In 1589, after a series of brutal murders and disappearances in the region, Stumpp was arrested. The victims, mostly women and children, had been found mutilated and torn apart, with evidence pointing to a wild animal attack. However, under intense torture, Stumpp confessed to being a werewolf. He claimed that he had made a pact with the devil, which allowed him to transform into a wolf-like creature at will. According to his confession, he would then roam the countryside, murdering and eating his victims. Stumpp also confessed to committing incest with his daughter and other heinous acts, though some historians believe these confessions were likely coerced under torture. The authorities believed Stumpp's claims and, after a trial, he was sentenced to death. In 1590, Peter Stumpp was executed in a gruesome manner. His execution was a spectacle, with reports stating that he was tortured, decapitated, and then burned alive. His execution was followed by the public display of his body to warn others of the consequences of witchcraft and dealings with the devil. The case of Peter Stumpp contributed to the widespread fear of werewolves in Europe during the 16th century. His brutal crimes and subsequent confession have made him one of the most infamous figures in the history of lycanthropy legends. His story has inspired various books, documentaries, and folklore, cementing his place as one of the earliest recorded werewolf criminals in history. Henri Désiré Landru. Henri Désiré Landru, born on April 12, 1869, in Paris, France, is infamous for being one of the most notorious criminals of early 20th century France. Known as the Bluebeard of Gambais after the legendary figure who murdered his wives, Landru was a man of charm and deceit. He was married with children, but his secret life would soon reveal a far darker side. In the early 1900s, Landru began to place personal ads in Paris newspapers, seeking women who were widows or single, and often promised them marriage and financial security. He would meet these women, charm them with his apparent kindness, and gain their trust. Once they had fallen for him, Landru would convince them to visit his isolated villa in Gambais, a small town outside of Paris. It was there that Landru's true intentions were revealed. At his villa, Landru would kill his victims, often strangling them or poisoning them, then burn their bodies to eliminate evidence. He was methodical in his murders, using his charm and intelligence to cover his tracks. At least 10 women, though some believe the number was higher, met their deaths at his hands. Landru's killing spree came to an end in 1919 after the disappearance of a woman named Louise Le Marchand raised suspicions. Authorities began investigating Landru, and after searching his villa, they found traces of the burned remains of several women, along with personal effects that linked him to the missing women. Landru was arrested and put on trial for the murders. During his trial, Landru showed little emotion, and he attempted to defend himself by claiming that he had been only a swindler and had not murdered anyone. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was convicted of multiple murders. Henri Désiré Landru was sentenced to death by guillotine and was executed on February 25, 1922. Landru's legacy has become one of criminal infamy, with his story inspiring books, films, and even operas. His charm and manipulative behavior have made him a subject of fascination for true crime enthusiasts. In France, he remains a chilling reminder of the hidden darkness behind seemingly ordinary lives. Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf. Peter Kürten, born on May 26, 1883, in Cologne, Germany, is remembered as one of the most notorious serial killers in German history. His early life was marked by violence and abuse. Growing up in a deeply dysfunctional family, Kürten was subjected to physical and sexual abuse by his father, and he later became involved in criminal behavior from a young age. His dark tendencies emerged early, with reports of him committing violent acts against animals and peers. Kürten's killing spree began in the late 1920s in Düsseldorf, where he terrorized the city with a series of brutal murders and attacks. His victims, mostly women and children, were subjected to horrific violence. Kürten would often stalk his victims before assaulting them, and his preferred methods of killing included stabbing, strangling, and even setting some of them on fire. He was known to take pleasure in the terror and pain he inflicted on his victims, and his brutal acts were accompanied by chilling confessions, which he later described as a thirst for blood, earning him the nickname the Vampire of Düsseldorf. Kürten's crimes went undetected for a while, as he moved around the city and continued his attacks. However, his reign of terror came to an end in 1930 when he was finally caught. The police investigation focused on a series of seemingly unrelated attacks, but a breakthrough came when a young woman survived an attack and was able to provide a detailed description of her assailant. This led to Kürten's capture, and he was quickly linked to the other murders. During his trial, Kürten confessed to at least 9 murders and 31 other violent attacks, though he was believed to have committed more. He claimed that he had a compulsion to kill and that the act of murder gave him a sense of power and satisfaction. Kürten was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to death. On July 2, 1931, Peter Kürten was executed by guillotine. His legacy, however, lives on as one of Germany's most horrific serial killers. The gruesome nature of his crimes, coupled with his chilling confessions, has made him a subject of study in criminology, and he remains a figure of terror in the annals of criminal history. Born on August 27, 1906, in Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gain's upbringing was marked by a deeply dysfunctional and abusive household. Raised by an overbearing and religiously fanatic mother, Augusta Gein, Ed's early life was shaped by isolation and control. His father was an alcoholic, and after his death, Ed and his brother Henri were left to live alone with their mother, who instilled in them an unhealthy and warped view of the world. Augusta despised women and taught Ed that all women were sinful. After the death of his mother in 1945, Ed Gein became increasingly reclusive. He lived alone on the family farm, where he began to indulge in bizarre and disturbing behavior. Gein's descent into madness became more evident when, in the 1950s, the police began to investigate a series of disappearances in the area. In 1957, the investigation led to the discovery of Gein's horrific crimes. Police discovered the remains of at least 2 women, including body parts such as skulls, faces, and organs, which Gein had preserved or turned into grotesque artifacts. Gein had also confessed to robbing graves and using the bodies to create furniture, clothing, and masks made from human skin. He allegedly believed that by wearing human skin, he could become a woman and appease his mother's strict beliefs. Gein was arrested and charged with the murder of 2 women, Bernice Wardens, a local store owner, and Mary Hogan, a tavern owner. During his trial, it was determined that Gein was insane, and he was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Wisconsin. Ed Gein's crimes shocked the nation and had a lasting impact on popular culture. His gruesome acts inspired numerous fictional characters, most famously Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Gein's legacy as a grotesque figure in horror history continues to linger, and his case remains a chilling reminder of the darkest corners of the human psyche. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., is one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history. His early life was marked by tragedy, with his father dying when Fish was just a child and his mother placing him in an orphanage. It was here that Fish began to develop disturbing tendencies. He was subjected to abuse and neglect, which some believe played a role in shaping his later crimes. Fish's first known crime occurred in 1924 when he lured a young girl named Grace Budd into his home. He promised to take her to a party, but instead he brutally murdered her. Fish's depravity didn't stop at killing, he also cannibalized his victims, claiming that he enjoyed eating their flesh. Over the years, Fish committed a series of horrific murders, though he was not apprehended for his crimes until 1934. In 1934, Fish was finally caught after he sent a letter to Grace Budd's parents, describing in graphic detail how he had murdered and eaten their daughter. The letter led to his arrest, and further investigation revealed the extent of his crimes. Fish had been a sadistic, calculating killer, and his crimes were not just limited to the Budd family. He had kidnapped, murdered, and cannibalized several children over the years. His actions were so grotesque that even hardened detectives were horrified by his confessions. During his trial, Fish claimed that he had been hearing voices urging him to commit these acts. Despite his apparent insanity, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair on January 16, 1936. Fish's legacy is one of terror, and he has become a symbol of the most grotesque forms of serial killing. His sadistic and cannibalistic acts have made him a subject of fascination for true crime enthusiasts and horror fiction alike. Albert Fish's story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in criminal history. Lizzie Borden. Born on July 19, 1860, in Fall River, Massachusetts, Lizzie Borden was a young woman from a respectable family. Her father, Andrew Borden, was a wealthy but strict man, while her stepmother, Abby, had a tense relationship with Lizzie. Growing up in a house filled with tension and financial anxiety, Lizzie's life appeared uneventful until the tragic events of August 4, 1892. On that fateful day, Andrew and Abby Borden were found brutally murdered in their home. Both victims had been struck repeatedly with an axe, and the gruesome nature of the crime shocked the community. Lizzie, who was in the house at the time, quickly became a prime suspect, but she denied any involvement. The police investigation revealed a number of strange circumstances, such as Lizzie's inconsistent statements and suspicious behavior. Despite this, there was little physical evidence to link her directly to the murders. Her defense argued that she was innocent, and many believed that the murders were too violent and personal for a woman to commit. Lizzie was eventually arrested and charged with the murders of her father and stepmother. During the trial, the prosecution struggled to present a clear motive for Lizzie's actions, and the defense countered with claims that Lizzie was a victim of years of familial tension and possibly even mental illness. After a sensational trial, Lizzie Borden was acquitted of all charges, and the case remains one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. Although Lizzie was acquitted, suspicion continued to surround her for the rest of her life. She lived out her years in Fall River, but her reputation was forever tainted. Lizzie Borden's story has been retold in books, plays, and films, and her name has become synonymous with axe murders. The mystery of whether she truly committed the murders or was innocent remains a topic of debate and fascination even today. Holmes. H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, is infamous for his gruesome crimes in the late 19th century. Holmes was an intelligent but manipulative man, known for his charm and ability to deceive others. He initially studied medicine and quickly found ways to exploit his knowledge for personal gain, engaging in fraudulent schemes and insurance scams. In 1893, during the Chicago World's Fair, Holmes opened a hotel that would later become infamous for its dark secrets. The hotel, dubbed the Murder Castle, was a large, labyrinthine structure filled with hidden passages, trapdoors, and soundproof rooms. It was here that Holmes carried out his horrific acts. He would lure women, sometimes under the pretense of marriage, to his hotel, where he would torture, murder, and then dispose of their bodies. Many of his victims were never seen again. Holmes was meticulous in his killings, using his knowledge of chemistry and medicine to create a killing ground. Some of the bodies were found in the walls of his hotel, while others were dismembered and sold to medical schools. The true number of Holmes' victims is unknown, but it is believed that he may have murdered up to 200 people. Holmes' crimes were discovered when his fraudulent activities and suspicious behavior caught the attention of investigators. He was eventually arrested in 1894 after being implicated in several insurance frauds. During his trial, Holmes confessed to multiple murders, though many believe he may have exaggerated the extent of his crimes to make himself seem more notorious. Holmes was convicted of one murder, that of his former business partner, and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on May 7, 1896. His story has since become one of the most chilling in American criminal history. H. Holmes' Murder Castle and his crimes have inspired numerous books, documentaries, and films, cementing his legacy as one of the most notorious criminals in the country. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful, please don't forget to give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below about anything I covered. Consider subscribing if you'd like to see more content like this. Thanks again, and take care.